Good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak at the Wallace Stegner Symposium this year. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the legal response to the plastic waste trade. My name is Jim Puckett. I am the director and founder of the Basel Action Network. This is an organization that is a watchdog of the Basel Convention and, of course, takes its name from the Basel Convention, which is the world's only treaty on waste. And I would posit that it's the only treaty really tackling environmental justice at the global stage. Very unique, very important convention. Bane has been a watchdog of it since 1997, and I personally have been involved since the beginning in 1989. Well, looking at the Basel Convention, it's important to understand what it's all about and what it does. And I'll break that into two sections, what I'll call soft law. These are general obligations, and hard law, which is the real nitty-gritty things that you can actually get arrested and go to jail for. But the general obligations are extremely important, and they include a call for every country to be self-sufficient in its waste management. It calls for minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous and other waste. Calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other waste. In other words, reduce it, don't produce it, is the ultimate goal. But when you can't do that, it calls for ensuring environmentally sound management of that waste which is produced. That's the soft law. Now, the hard law, first of all, it defines what it's going to be considering and controlling. And that is hazardous waste and another category, which is called other waste. And hazardous waste is going to be defined by annexes 1, 3, and 8. And it's also defined by whatever one country claims to be a hazardous waste. Every country has a sovereign right to make its own hazardous waste list, and the rest of the world has to respect that. Then we have the category of other waste, which is Annex 2. These are wastes for special consideration, not necessarily hazardous. These include household waste, like household garbage, and incinerator ashes from burning household waste. And most recently, and most importantly to this discussion, we have a new listing of certain plastic wastes, those that are difficult to recycle and problematic. Those are now newly listed, and this is the subject of today's discussion. The controls then, so that defines what we're going to control, but the controls of these things are, by default, a procedure called prior informed consent or notification and consent. Sets out that every country that's going to be sending a controlled waste has to first notify the other country, and they have to agree to it before it can go. And without that procedure, it's considered illegal traffic. And illegal traffic under the convention is a criminal act. Then we have prohibitions. Countries can ban imports on a national basis. There's a ban on exports to Antarctica. There's a ban on trade between parties and non-parties unless you have a special agreement known as an Article 11 agreement. This is an extremely important part because the US is a non-party. US is a big fish in a global waste pond and probably per capita produces more waste than any other country. And it not being a party is glaring and creates interesting things, which we will discuss. Then we have the Basel Ban Amendment, something I've worked on for over 20 years and was proud to say it finally entered into force in 2019. This is a full prohibition on the exports of hazardous waste from developed countries, defined roughly as the OECD countries, to the countries not in the OECD group. That's known as the Basel Ban Amendment. But today, we're not going to be looking at the Ban Amendment, but looking more closely at these new plastics amendments. The Basel Convention as a whole is enjoying amazing saturation. I don't know of another treaty that has so much percentage of the world being members and parties to it. There are 187 Basel country members. So there's just 8 other UN nations which are not yet a party to it. These include East Timor, Grenada, Fiji, Haiti, San Marino, the Solomon Islands, South Sudan, and the USA. I created this map because it was a lot easier to show the non-parties than it would be to show all the parties. And this is glaring when we see the US sticking out like a real sore thumb here. In the beginning, the Basel Convention was all about controlling industrial waste, factory waste. But today we find that most of what is traded that is problematic is what we call post-consumer waste, waste from you and I. And this includes electronic waste, which is primarily going to Africa and Asia today, really a big problem still. And the shipbreaking trade, these are old ships that are dumped on the beaches of South Asia, and the poorest of the poor communities are dealing with these basically by hand. The asbestos, the PCBs, the heavy metals, extreme problem for the workers. And finally, and newly, the plastic waste trade has become the focus of global attention. Most of that now going to Southeast Asia, as we'll discuss. So why were these plastic amendments seen as so important? Why did Norway spearhead the effort to use and do something about these amendments in the Basel Convention? Well, first of all, we had the national sword policy, which I briefly mentioned, where China decided to ban plastic imports. Boom. March 2018, no more, enough. They had been taking the lion's share of the world's plastic waste, primarily from Europe and North America. The film Plastic China revealed to the world what was going on in these villages that were accepting all of this waste. The film focused on the human impacts of the children, of the parents, of the dirt and the filth and the contamination that these villages suffered through to make a small living on our plastic waste. That film was shown in China once, and then it was banned, and then 2 weeks later, the national sword policy banned all imports of plastic waste into China. And you can see what happened. In 2017, on the column on the left, you see most of the G7's plastic waste was flowing to China and Hong Kong. And you can see what happened after the ban from the G7 waste. Most of it now scattered to Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Taiwan, Indonesia, Turkey, Thailand. And we're in the midst of that chaos right now on the right, where brokers are looking for places every day to send this material. The China ban forced things to go to Southeast Asia primarily. And their sad effects, most of it, the recycling is incomplete. It's not economic to recycle all of this material. It's so dirty, it's so mixed. It gets dumped, and very often it gets burned, open burning of plastic waste. So that became known increasingly. And at the same time, and actually a little before that, the world was waking up to the marine pollution by plastics. I'm sure you've all heard of the statement that in a few years' time, there will be more volume of plastic than there will be volume of fish in the seas, will become true if we don't act. And the world was shocked by what they learned and what they saw every day with the interaction of plastic in our marine environment. So that was really high on the agenda of a lot of policymakers. And they realized, and a lot of people began to push and beat the drum for a globally binding instrument on the entire life cycle of plastics. And that's probably going to be needed, but people also realize that, wow, we have some conventions ready to go. They won't take years to negotiate. We can use them today. And that's what Norway realized. And in May 2019, after only 18 months from conception to law, which is remarkable, we got these new ban amendments in place, passed by consensus. And what was their intention? It was really about controlling difficult to recycle, unlikely to be recycled plastics. And these are plastic waste mixtures, contaminated plastic waste, The language in the convention says it has to be almost free from contamination, and halogenated polymers like PVC were to be controlled. And anything that was not assured of environmentally sound management at the receiving end needed to be controlled. And it also could not be subject to burning, even formal burning like waste to energy, forbidden in terms of an exemption. It would need to be controlled if these things were true. The default control was to be prior informed consent, but as we'll see, there's actually a lot of bans involved here as well. Failure to comply, again, is illegal traffic and a criminal act. So the situation, except for the US, is pretty straightforward. There's a basic Basel party to Basel party. Yes, you can trade in these new Annex 2 wastes, which is where most of these new listings will live, in Annex 2. You can trade, but you'll need prior informed consent between Basel parties. However, the EU, the 27 member states of the EU, had long ago included Annex 2 in its ban on exports of hazardous waste, the Basel Ban Amendment, to developing countries. So if you're not an OECD country and you're a Basel party, the EU is not allowed to send you these new Annex 2 listings of plastics. Very important. And then we have the US. Remember I said we're sticking out like a sore thumb. We're a real renegade when it comes to international multilateral agreements. And we, not being Basel parties, will be subject to being part of criminal traffic and waste if we continue to send our plastic material to Basel parties. The only exception right now is Canada, which they have a Article 11 agreement formed very rapidly. We don't think it's a valid agreement, but they have one, which they both abide by. And then the only other option for the US is to send to other non-parties, which again is a tiny little list of tiny little countries: Grenada, Haiti, San Marino. So the US is really in a tricky situation now, suddenly, as of the date that this new amendment went into force, which was January 1 of this year. As of that time, these countries are off limits in terms of legal trade. And you see that these are the countries that have been receiving most of our plastic waste. So we, after 1 month, we finally were able to get the data. And in Bane, we published what we found out of the first month's data after the new rules went into effect. And we saw the January data, and oh my God, we saw that there has been very little change. In fact, some countries like Malaysia got an increase. If you look at the last two columns between December and January, you look at all of them, the 2020 results of exports to non-OECD countries, you see that in January, very little had changed, basically average to what had been going on before these amendments were in effect. The reasons we know most US plastic waste exports qualify as being illegal exports is primarily because our municipal recycling facilities and our electronics recyclers are unable to achieve high levels of purity. They are contaminated. The Basel Convention requires almost free from contamination and other types of waste. We can't make that cut. Mixed waste, where our MRFs, our materials recycling facilities, cannot fully sort plastic polymer types very often. So the other reason is that we are still exporting a lot of PVC in these mixes or separately. And those are definitely definitively on Annex 2. So our municipal waste, again, this is what it looks like, nice, neat little blocks. But unfortunately, in those blocks are every type of polymer you can imagine. Other stuff like paper and wood and dirt that are not recyclable. And this is what we've been exporting, and now it's not going to be allowed anymore. Same with electronic waste. Wow, the recyclers aren't able to sort this material. We know we have an electronics recycler program called eStewards. They can't manage it. So here's an example of a MRF's output in a California bale composition study. This is a bale of something they have been very proud to separate and sort. and it's a bale of PET bottles. Unfortunately, the average is 14.1% other. In other words, contamination, not going to cut the new rules. And for example, these are the known contamination rates allowed by the importing countries since the Basel Amendments came into place. Each country is setting up their own cutoff point. And you can see they're all well below the 10%, even for PET, which is the poster child of good recycling. So we are well out of range with respect to honoring the contamination commitments of the new amendments. So the New York Times took our study and put this out. It's really important to get the word out that we are a country in violation. We as consumers are part and parcel of this violation of international law. We're part of criminal traffic in waste because our cities, wherever you happen to live, Seattle, you name it. This is where I live, New York, Houston, Salt Lake City. All of these MRFs and waste haulers are not able to meet these requirements, and they have nowhere to go with this waste. Unfortunately, they're still trying to export it. So you ask, and I'm sure you'll ask, what if the US were to ratify the Basel Convention? What kind of things would that do? What changes would that make? And we're absolutely hoping this will happen finally, that we have this new pressure from the plastic waste trade. But what will happen is that US exports of these new Annex II wastes will be allowed to other Basel parties, but you'll have to get their consent. Like Malaysia, you'll have to ask them and they'll have to say yes. The US government would be obliged to enforce and prosecute the illegal trade. Right now, they don't have to do anything. They can sit on their hands. Once it gets on the high seas, it's the other country's problem. US exports to developing countries of e-waste and hazardous waste would be barred because of the hazardous waste prohibition and the Basel Bane Amendment. And US recyclers would import hazardous waste from the non-OECD world. They could finally do that. And this would be good for the environment in most cases. So for example, the Caribbean, they can't legally export their waste, and it's stacking up on the islands, their hazardous waste, to the United States, which is so close by. What the future may hold for plastic waste, my view that sitting from where I'm sitting now, this is what's likely to happen in the next 5 years. There'll be increasing efforts by waste brokers to defy these new amendments. There'll be increasing numbers of exposés by groups like ours. There'll be increasing pressure on the Basel parties to enforce the new listings like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and to enforce the environmentally sound management of the facilities. There will be realized and revealed that there's an inherent lack of circularity of plastic. Plastic is not made to be circular, and unfortunately, this is the crux of so much of the problem. This will be increasingly revealed as there's more scrutiny on what really is happening. And industry will then seek to increase their single-use plastic production. This is already happening to make way for more uses of fossil fuels, but they're going to justify it by selling plastic waste as the latest green coal, the latest energy source, from refuse-derived fuel, polymer to fuel schemes, waste to energy schemes, and they will sell these to developing countries. This will be their way forward, I'm afraid. And a plastic policy war may ensue between those that seek to reduce plastic, single-use plastic prohibitions, legislation, and those that seek to burn it and continue production as usual. Now, a better vision, a better future can be imagined. And this is my dream, that plastics and their role in exacerbating climate change and global pollution becomes fully recognized, that single-use plastics are eliminated for all but vital, for example, medical uses. Polymer and plastic additive types are reduced, with difficult to recycle polymers or hazardous plastic additives phased out completely. And plastic is used only and primarily for long-lived, easily collected and safely recycled uses. And finally, we learned that convenience, which is why we're all hooked on plastic, let's face it, convenience is relative to the impacts of our very future, our very existence. And we also will realize that that place, that magical place where we throw things, is a place, and it's a place on Earth, and people live there. I thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.